we left off kind of halfway through my presentation about the beginning of life last week. It's kind of hard to stuff all of that in 40 minutes, but I tried. We'll get a little bit through the end of that presentation this morning, hopefully, and then we'll be able to move on to the creation of man. I had just started talking about intelligent design. And I actually have an exercise here.
You going to test our intelligence?
Okay, let's see.
I'm not falling for those again.
You're not falling for these again? Okay, here you go. You're wise with it. Okay. And I just need a couple more people. Let's see. I do. Who wants? There you go. Okay. And Bruce, I have one for you. Okay. This is my demonstration model here. Okay, you all know what these are, right?
It's a trap. It's a rat trap.
It's a mouse trap. Yeah, this one's a rat trap, but it's a big version of the one that I just passed out. Now, I want you all to see if you can't do this without losing your finger. Take the spring mechanism, put this over, put it on the little catch.
Remember, don't lose fingers.
Right, don't. Yeah, this one I will lose a finger with. Okay, now it's ready to do its job. Can everybody get that done?
Mine's missing a part.
Which part is it missing?
The catch.
The catch.
Oh, I see.
Bruce, can you get yours done?
Nope.
All right, let me show you what Bruce's looks like. Do you think this will work? It has all the parts, all the same parts.
That's a prototype, right?
Yeah. It's not made out of the right material. Okay, who else has one? Could you do yours?
Yeah, I'm just holding it,
You're holding it. Why are you holding it?
just in case.
You're missing this part though, aren't you?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Just in case.
Oh, I'll let it go.
Yeah, let it go before you hand it to me. Anybody else got one? Okay, did you get yours set?
The dog's too short.
Ah, your part is too short. It won't reach the little catch. So yeah, it won't function either. So each of these demonstrates a principle that I'm going to get to in just a minute. I think you actually got a whole piece there. You got a whole device. But I can tell you don't catch mice very often, do you?
Am I doing it wrong?
Yeah. But that's actually good. You played right into the game there. Now what is it if you have a hard time setting this one? This one's bent. It's damaged. So that's why it didn't work. It wasn't because he didn't know how to set it, but that's important as well. So each one of these has a flaw. So let's say you were evolving mouse traps. One thing that we found out is to survive, all the parts have to be in place at the same time. You can't be missing a single part. You can't have parts that don't work because of some material property, and you can't set one that's been damaged or has a defect. Okay? So the whole idea behind intelligent design is that we can look at things like mouse traps and tell if they've been designed because they have this characteristic about it. And that's something they call, wait for it, specified complexity or irreducible complexity. And the mousetrap is an example of irreducible complexity. So I mentioned this last week, is natural information like crystals are an amazing thing, but we don't necessarily think that they have an intelligent designer behind them. Now, that's arguable, okay? But we can explain in detail how crystals form. And we know what they're made out of, and we know what conditions they work. And they're easily explained by natural processes. And whether or not you think the natural process itself is designed, that's kind of another issue that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to find my little device here. And natural information like the Grand Canyon, it can also be very complex, but it's not terribly, it doesn't conform to a particular pattern that we recognize, and that's what they call specified complexity. And, okay. Sorry, there was a little pop-up window on my screen. There we go. So complex, information that's both complex and specified. In other words, it's complex and it has a pattern, implies, or as Dembski says, requires design. There's also this irreducible complexity where functions are mutually dependent and components, like the pieces of the mousetrap, are unlikely to have evolved gradually because you need every component to be there at the beginning in order for the thing or the creature to survive or to perform its function. We did talk about that last week. I showed the little video of the flagellum motor being an irreducibly complex item as claimed by one of these adherents. We talked about the mousetrap. Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, and he went into great detail to explain this irreducible complexity. He said, imagine that we're designing a bicycle, okay? And it has all of these functions that are mutually dependent, but we can kind of see, in fact, if you look at the history of bicycles, you know, the first ones were just kind of clunky wooden sticks with a couple of wheels on it, and then somebody decided to add pedals, and then after that, after you had the big wheelers, the high wheelers, they decided to add chains so they could transfer it. So in sort of a mechanistic sense, even though it's kind of silly, you can see how a bicycle would evolve. All right. So let's say this is our bicycle, and all of a sudden we're going to make a motorcycle. Okay, it's kind of like a bicycle. Well, what do we have to put in it? A motor. All right. Now, how do we stepwise account for a motor coming in through gradual development? You had to take one completely different technology, an internal combustion motor, and join it with another technology, a bicycle, in order to come up with a motorcycle. And that's the analogy. He says that that's what we see in biological systems. We see things that are incredibly complex, that are unlikely to have evolved in stepwise fashion. Now, is it the answer? I was going to say that, let me read something here. Michael Behe himself said, throughout history, the detection of design has been a rather intuitive business. It's kind of like pornography. We couldn't define it, but we knew it when we saw it. And so his whole process was trying to identify what makes something designed. Can we quantify that? Can we approach it scientifically? We recognize design when we see a pattern, one that could only be achieved by a highly improbable event. If I stumbled across a pile of rocks alongside a hill that spelled out in capital letters, "Greetings, Earthlings," this would be a recognizable and highly improbable pattern. I would therefore naturally assume that it was created by an intelligent designer. And you remember me mentioned William Paley in his watchmaker argument. The trouble with this idea is there are a lot of things in nature that have a recognizable pattern, and they seem like they're highly improbable, except on closer examination, they can be explained fully using natural laws. So, here's the problems with intelligent design. Now, I think there's still a lot to intelligent design, but there are some problems with it you need to be aware of before you say, hey, that's the answer. You know, I was real excited about Behe's book when I first read it, and then I've since read the criticism of it, and I can see where they're coming from. I don't think it's enough to kill that idea off, but you just have to be aware of its weaknesses. First one, when it comes to religion, is there's this issue of the God of the gaps. What that means is there anything that I can't explain, God must have done it. Okay, that's a logical argument fallacy, and it's called an argument from silence. In other words, if you can't explain something, you jump to some conclusion and attribute it to God. It dodges the God question. They don't come out and say that it's God. They talk about it as the intelligent agent, although everybody knows that. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. Who is this intelligent agent if not God? And in fact, the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey has a great scene at the beginning where they kind of transfer that responsibility to another intelligent civilization, if you've ever read the book. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, it doesn't really say that God did it. It just says there's an intelligent agent. It can't be used to explain certain natural processes because in order to do that, we need to use the scientific method. Okay, it kind of invalidates our methodology of science, which is to understand that processes are consistent, and it's likely that if we see any occurrence, we should be able to look at some natural process that can explain that occurrence. It's not testable or falsifiable if you use supernatural as an explanation. In other words, if you just say God made it, that settles it, correct? I mean, that's right. However God made it, we don't really care. If God made it, that kind of shuts down any kind of explanations of how. And finally, nature does have apparent mistakes. We can see remnants of things that look like random. They used to call it junk DNA, although they've since found that there's functions for even things that don't seem to have a function at first. Again, the naturalist or the theistic naturalist would say, "Hey, that's awesome. I want to find out what God did here." But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have some kind of natural process involved. And finally, it's a compromise. It's not fully creationism. God didn't, poof, make the whole world in 6 days, which is a problem if you're trying to reconcile it with a literal understanding of Scripture. But it's also not fully evolution in this case. So the one thing they noted about it, though, is there are some good arguments, and it makes people mad. And the reason it makes people angry is because they immediately assume intelligent design is just a way to get around problems with big C creationism, young earth creationism. And if you go out there and you talk about intelligent design to people who are not believers, they will particularly kind of say, they'll just write you off as a creationist, or as a young earth creationist or a crackpot. So you have to understand what the science is about. Again, I still think it has some very interesting things going on, and it's worth understanding. So our conclusion last week, there's a difference between microevolution and macroevolution. There's various gradations in between. Some people think that God just created the universe with a big bang, and then after that everything ran on its own, like you set a top spinning and God just went away after that. Well, we know that isn't true from Scripture, but that's the farthest away you can get from the other one. And on the other hand, there are people that believe God created everything that you see nowadays exactly as it is, not very long ago. And things that have happened interveningly may or may not be created by God. And so they apply that thinking to evolution. But neither one explains how things get started. Okay. However, the Bible still provides an elegant, reasonable explanation for the beginning of life. And for how it's lasted, that God creates things both by fiat, ex nihilo, or poof, all at once, and by fashion, by making. And He also provides for His creation. The Bible tells us that God continues to provide in whatever way for His creation, because He has a relationship with His creation and with living things. Okay, so that was what I'd hoped to finish last week. So now I have half an hour to finish this week. And bear with me just a second while I start that one. Yay. see if it works now. Okay, so we talked about the origin of life. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the origin of man. This is also something you can't really stuff in 40 minutes, so you may walk away from here not very satisfied, but we're going to do our best to try to hit the high points and find out what's important. Recognize this scene? Okay, this. Okay, there it is. 1,000,000 years of evolution in 1 minute and 30 seconds. That was a scene from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which it's still one of my favorite movies of all time, and not because of that, although that's kind of funny. But that is actually the interesting thing about that is the scene at the very beginning that you see is the monolith, or the black sentinel. If you're into science fiction, that's actually a detector of intelligent life that was planted by an alien civilization on the Earth and on the Moon. So that's what that thing is. You don't really know that from watching the movie, but if you're a hardcore sci-fi fan, you have to go out and get the book and figure out what it is. So they found out that there was something happening on Earth, that some intelligent life was possible, but the interesting assumption was they knew that those guys wouldn't become really human or really intelligent or really something that was to be reckoned with unless they helped out a little bit. So the scene at the very beginning where they're all standing around that black monolith, the black monolith is sending out some kind of a beam that rearranges the atoms in their brain and makes them intelligent. Okay? And once that happens, the one monkey moonwatcher wakes up the next morning and realizes, hey, this bone is good for something else besides, eating off of or, tossing around. I can use it to kill these animals that, and it start eating meat. And then once he does that, which you didn't see that, then he figures out, well, I can use this to kill my fellow primates and dominate them, and so on and so forth. So really, that's the idea. And the interesting thing is what is it about man that makes us different from the animals? The hypothesis in 2001: A Space Odyssey was aliens did it. All right? But what we know about Scripture is that God did it. So what does our view of origin say about who we are, not just what we are? So we're going to go back to our Bible. In Genesis 1, verse 26 through 20, verses 26 through 28, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." And He gave us responsibilities, and He gave us a blessing to be fruitful and multiply. I read this also last week. So what is it that's God's image? And somebody asked this question last week. The word is actually called Tselem, I believe. And that means an image or a shadow, or not really the actual thing, but a reflection, if you will, of God. It's sometimes used to refer to idols. They're not real gods, but they're sort of a reflection of a god. But what it doesn't mean is it doesn't mean that man is physically like God. And it doesn't mean that man is God-like, that we have the essence or power of God. And finally, it doesn't mean that man is God. So that automatically takes some religions off the table with regard to comparison with the Christian scriptures. The image of God is also unique to man. It's not used to describe anything else. And it's what makes us different from animals. You know, it could be as grand as the difference between a man and a worm, or it could be as subtle as the difference between Moonwatcher and all of his primate buddies in that little scene that you see. But it's still something that's unique, that distinguishes us from other life. Thomas Aquinas recognized this. He said, while in all creatures there is some kind of likeness to God, in the rational creature alone we find a likeness of this image. Now, the intellect or mind is that whereby the rational creature excels other creatures. Wherefore, this image of God is not found even in the rational creature except in the mind. Now, it doesn't necessarily exclude that we can't find other rational creatures that are self-aware. Maybe there are some today. Maybe we'll find some on another planet. Who knows? It just typically refers to man himself. And Aquinas recognized that ages ago. So what about physical man? Do you think that man, having evolved or having been specially created like he is right now? Yeah. Yeah. What does that do for us? Does that make us any less valuable? Or does that say anything about the truth of Scripture?
Are you asking?
Yeah.
What was the question?
The question is, does the fact that we evolved, or the fact that we were specially created like we are now, does that change the way you look at the truth of Scripture? If you believe one way or the other.
As to whether we evolved or whether we were created instantly?
Yes. Does it make a difference?
It does.
And in what way?
Well, the Scripture says that God created the man from the dust of the earth.
Okay. And there are people who would say that that's typically a metaphor for evolution. Since if you created man from the dust of the earth, that little bitty creature at the beginning came from the dust of the earth, and that he created over a long period of time.
Well, in my humble but accurate opinion,
Yeah. Awesome.
they've got the right to be wrong.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Yes, sir.
Well, I think I mentioned briefly last week, back to the scriptures that you put up there, Genesis. God gave a mandate that he created man and male and female, and he said, okay, I want you to rule over the animals on the earth and the fish in the sea and the birds of the sky. So we see that today, that man is doing that.
Mm-hmm.
He can herd cattle. Cattle don't herd people. Animals are in zoos. You know, the animals do not take humans and put them
Right.
in zoos.
Right.
So therefore, you know, that could never happen if evolution was involved.
Why so?
Because if we are descended from apes, the apes should have disappeared a long time ago. That's right.
The apes should have disappeared a long time ago?
Through evolution, because they should no longer be around, but they're still around.
So let me go to the next one.
You just you keep going to a higher life form, right? As you evolve.
That's the point of evolution, is to continue to get better, essentially. So why would apes still be around if humans just got so awesome? Apes would, that would be something that would die out.
The easy explanation by the evolutionist is that there was not a problem with the original ape design, so to speak, that just certain apes were, because of random mutations, were fitter, and so outpopulated other apes in certain areas.
Well, then how come they can't communicate? With the humans that have evolved since then.
Well, some people would say they have. They've figured out ways to speak to primates. Here's actually the answer to that question: is the ancestral tree is not a single line. It's more like a bush or a tree with all of these different aspects. And evolutionary science says, we're at the top of the tree, and that's why we dominate all of the other creatures. But there are also, like Neanderthals here, that have lived for a while and then died out for some reason. And all of these other species over here that aren't around anymore, they're exactly like you say. They all died out. But it's saying somewhere down here is a common ancestor that are ancestors to all of these other primates. We just happen to be the ones that have survived until today.
Okay, well then, you know, of all these questions that you keep, you know, throwing out there, like from, you know, the scientific arguments and different scientific communities and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
you know, God anticipated all that. He said, okay, I'm going to make man, but there's a purpose. And I've also got these animals and these plants and these birds and fish and so forth. So I want you to rule over them.
Okay?
So that is going on. That is happening.
Sure.
And so the animals, they're not, you know, smart enough to do that.
So I'm trying to make the connection between evolution and why that would not be true for evolution.
Well, evolution, if, you know, at one point, if it's just evolution by itself, then the mankind did not rule over the fish of the sea. But Adam's been doing that, or the birds of the air, or the cattle. But man has been doing that since Adam. Come here, Adam, I want you to tend the garden. So
Okay.
he's ruling over the plants of the earth.
So nobody would argue with that who's an evolutionist. They would say that whenever Adam came along, you know, he is above all of the other animals.
Don't you
And
think that at some point, if you go the evolution route, that man was not smart enough to rule over the animals?
no,
other animals?
no, I wouldn't think that. Man has obviously been at the top of the food chain in the last 1,000,000 years. And I would say it doesn't really have anything to do with man's responsibility. It's basically his physical composition. And my whole point here is not to argue one way or the other. It's just to say that the biblical description still works, regardless of what you believe.
So you're kind of saying that in the evolutionary view, is saying everything below you are here is not man. It might be
Correct. Right.
evolutionary ancestors, but it's
And, you know, man is, what is it that makes man different from all these other creatures? These are not men.
So would that be microevolution or macro? That would be micro. If it
Yeah,
was-
microevolution, in fact, there's a lot of, is this tree by itself. Macroevolution is all the way from bacteria, they call it organic evolution, from proteins in the original soup all the way to man, that each species that's branched off. These are all theoretically very closely related, and that's the whole study.
Microevolution, really, when you keep describing, it sounds more like adaptation of species.
Correct. So the idea behind the 2001 video and the idea behind the evolutionary theologists, or so to speak, the ones who are still Christian believers, my hypothesis is that you can't say if you believe in evolution you're not a Christian. And that's what I want to hear feedback about. Because all of the same aspects, man having responsibility over all the animals, and the appearance of man in terms of complexity and in the right order and at the right time, all of those things still hold true. Yes, sir.
So if we were hypothetically all believers, but also believe in evolution, then we have to take Genesis as one big metaphor in the creation standpoint, because evolution took billions of years. So to speak.
I don't say you have to take Genesis as a metaphor, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But there are people that do. Yes.
So, one way of looking at it would be natural stuff happened to eventually come to the creature that we call man,
Correct.
and that maybe at that point God intervened right then at man and made him different or special or like through that
Yes.
kind of natural process that's like you said the aliens came in and did
Yeah.
something right then.
Or maybe
That difference.
maybe an unnatural process.
Well, right. I mean,
Yeah.
right. I don't mean aliens, but that at that point in natural history, if you're going to look at it from the science term, there was a supernatural intervention that set man apart.
Right. That's a very popular idea as well. Yes, Phil.
The idea that really needs to be wrestled with is the doctrine of original sin and the ramifications of it one way or the other. And like what she's talking about, there's a theory of Homo divinus in which there may have been populations throughout the earth that evolved into Homo sapiens, but then God imbued and selected an Adam and Eve,
Right.
divinus, and
Exactly.
fused them with the image of God, the Imago Dei.
Yeah. The image of God. Yes.
I think
part of the confusion is that the word evolution is used in two different ways as kind of a bait and switch, in that there's evolution as a biological mechanism and there's evolution as a worldview.
Yes.
And that worldview is not compatible with Christian theology. If you say we just evolved, that word just meaning it happened.
Right. And God wasn't an agent in that.
But the reason I call it a bait and switch is somebody say, well, do you believe that each generation is slightly different than the one before it, and there's no problem? Oh, then you believe my nihilistic worldview, this atheistic philosophy and so forth that I'm calling biology.
That's a good comment. Yes.
When God created Adam and Eve, essentially he made them perfect in the garden. So if the whole premise of evolution is to evolve the species.
When you say perfect, what do you mean by perfect?
Who were Adam and Eve's parents?
Mentally, physically, spiritually perfect.
They say God.
Granted, they succumbed to temptation in the garden, but when he made them, like they were immortal. They had life everlasting. Like he made them perfect until they succumbed to the sin. But the whole premise of evolution is that it's evolving. So how could we evolve to what we are now if Adam and Eve were already perfect? It doesn't make sense.
But
If death came through the one man, life came through the new Adam.
right,
Because it refers to that in the New Testament.
and then he wiped them all out.
Right.
So,
Right. Right.
like one family.
That's right. That's right.
One other thing, also, if you take it from a perspective of you evolve from a lower life form to a higher life form, then you're saying all life is equal, and
No, that doesn't follow.
because and then so how would God say, okay, I'm gonna give my spirit to this particular highly evolved one, but not to a bird or not to whatever.
Same
Well-
way he chose Israel from all nations.
Right. I mean, God is sovereign. He can decide what he's going to do. He's not required.
Actually prove it one way or the other.
No, nobody can prove it. If it would, we wouldn't be having this discussion right now. Yeah. And I have 15 minutes, right? Yes.
Scott, I think everybody's brought up the most important point in this whole thing is that this really does get down to the theology of how do we deal with sin and reconcile that with all of us having to, in some sense, come from the one man, so that
Right.
the theology of sin is not disrupted, and therefore make the theology of Christ's salvation completely null and void.
Right. And that gets back to the point of original sin. And if you really want to follow that too, I did post an interesting article about how the Catholic Church, how they've wrestled with that same idea, because they're right out front. They have no objection to evolution at all, even to organic evolution. And they say that thing that makes man different from animals is the image of God, which is basically man's ability to be intelligent, to understand God, to have a relationship with God, and also to sin and to break that relationship and to be in need of repairing that relationship. We don't ascribe that to any animal either, And again, the Bible is about the whole story of Adam and Eve is about that relationship and about restoring that relationship throughout history. And I'd say it has a lot less to do about how man got here and what his physical characteristics are and how he got his brain and so forth. There are some places where the biblical account is consistent, is that man came from one place, the so-called Garden of Eden. There are competing theories where it says that man came from different parts of the earth at the same time. Again, I would ask the question, does that really make a difference in terms of what the story is about in the Garden of Eden? Is the secret in the way we're made? Science tends to identify man by his physical characteristics, by our skull capacity, by walking upright, and similarities to modern humans. Is this what Adam was all about? Consider the case of the Neanderthal. Neanderthals were thought to be ancestors of modern man, but now that we've been able to, they actually thought because they were beefier, that they were a perfect adaptation for that rougher lifestyle, and that we came from them because they were very manlike in the way they behaved. And here's some images that was common in literature of the early part of the 20th century. And but when they really start looking at Neanderthals, they find out they're unrelated to modern Homo sapiens. They're not the same thing. They're still a Homo sapiens, they classify them now, but they're not Homo sapiens sapiens, which is what our classification is. And they, interestingly enough, they've also found that modern humans have some Neanderthal DNA, but we are not Neanderthals. And so that branch completely died out. And they had larger brain capacities than we do today. And so, who knows? You know, were they intelligent? They have a lot of the same characteristics that we know about modern man. They had buried their dead, and they used tools. So in a lot of ways, they were very much like modern men. So I've actually heard some people say that those were the Nephilim that were described in the Old Testament.
So I say even the DNA between the chimpanzee and the man is 98% the same.
Right, right. And 78% or 82% between a human and a banana, which I mentioned last week, which doesn't really say much. You know, there's just a little change in the DNA will make a big difference. So here's somebody who's actually reconstructed from a skull, the way they do forensic reconstruction, you know, to tell what people look like if all they have left is their bones. They actually did this with a Neanderthal.
Was the skeletal similarities the main connection that they made between Neanderthal and man before they did all the DNA research?
They looked at it based on, similarities, the same structures that they found in the bones. And then they confirmed that they do share more DNA with modern humans than like chimpanzees or other samples that they've been able to get. And they lived recently enough that they could recover the DNA. But so what do you make of that, you know? And my point here is that the man of the Bible had a soul. He worshiped, he designed, he spoke, and he was self-aware as we are today. Okay? Physical gradual evolution from a common ape ancestor, it doesn't explain in and of itself how we are different from the animals. We need the Bible to be able to tell us that. The anthropological definition of man is less complete than the biblical definition because we are made in God's image.